Something we know is that we live in a world and a system that primarily benefits from our triggers and trauma responses and coping mechanisms, whether that be alcohol, drugs, food, or otherwise. And a system that benefits from our trauma responses is a system that's going to want to keep us in mental, emotional, and spiritual bondage for its own benefit. And so it will never actually try to get to the underlying solution of any of those conditions or the society that it serves. And something we're really beginning to understand now is the way in which we are offering our soul as tribute for the instant gratification of the ego's narrative. And so in that sense, the beneficiaries of this system have a vested interest to not only normalize our trauma responses, enmeshment wounds, or otherwise, but to embrace and celebrate them, whether it be overindulgence or otherwise. And something that we also understand is that when someone is diagnosed with cancer, we show them empathy, compassion. We try to get to the underlying root and condition and to really help them heal and transcend cancer. We don't celebrate cancer or throw a party for it, which is what this society has been leading us to really do in every way, shape, or form by embracing all of our trauma responses. Healthcare is a great example. Before we have a healthcare problem, we have a health problem in this third density matrix paradigm. And so something else that's going to be important to understand beyond this point is the way in which triangulating people really benefits this system. Because the more people can identify with extrasensory identity, whether it be race, religion, or otherwise, the more they can marry their identifying ego to that specific identity and have that aspect of themselves revolve around their focus and attention. So, for example, whenever we think about a way to control the masses or the best way to control people, it's never going to be through helping them discern, identify, and really think critically. Because a society that can think critically and that can discern and really get to know thyself is not a society that is very easy to emotionally manipulate. We must understand that whenever we have unhealed trauma and wounds and coping mechanisms, it's going to be very easy to leverage our emotions. And whatever system or party can best leverage our emotions, whether it be religion or government, then the more leverage they have for their self-serving agenda. And so whenever emotions can be leveraged to this degree, it's very easy to get people to get so caught up or so gaslit in those systems and emotions. The easier it is to emotionally manipulate them based on those emotions or identifying identity. And in doing so, then it can be capitalized by those, leveraging those emotions into different issues that continue to serve their agenda. And so this is what brings us now into the third density awareness of consciousness. So something that we understand is that we only see the world through our level of perception. And so if you ask a mechanic if he can explain a car to you, he will be easily able to do so. Same with a doctor. We have heard so many times that we may come to see a world where artificial intelligence or machines will come to rule, overtake, and kill humanity. However, there is a very high likelihood that we are already those machines. If we think about our brain, it is different, yes, than a motor in a car, but nonetheless, it is programmable, and we live off of the programming that our brain has translated and the inputs and stimuli that it has absorbed in this density, and it's operating off of that programming. Because we see the world from a level of perception, we cannot quite comprehend ourselves being machines, but the brain is no different than any other computing system. It is more complex. It doesn't have oil and gas, but it does have blood. And so in that sense, we are so much like those machines already. But beyond our own immediate level of perception, it is hard for us to comprehend, or better yet, it's harder for the mind to really release itself into allowing itself to comprehend anything above where our focus is, which again, it's easier to keep people in a system where their primary focus is survivalship and complacency than it is to actually discern, grow, expand into our higher dimensional awareness as multi-dimensional beings having a human experience. And the reason I bring that up is because just as we can explain, a doctor can explain the human body, a mechanic can explain a car, something that we hear over and over again from many scientists is not only that time-space is man-made, and if time-space is man-made, then it's so much easier to think of everything in density and frequency. And so even luminaries like Elon Musk have said that this is very likely already a simulation.
I've had so many simulation discussions, it's crazy.
Okay.
And remember, like the strongest argument for us being in a simulation, probably being in a simulation, I think is the following. That 40 years ago, we had Pong, like 2 rectangles and a dot. That was what games were. Now, 40 years later, we have photorealistic 3D simulations with millions of people playing simultaneously, and it's getting better every year. And soon we'll have virtual reality, we'll have augmented reality. If you assume any rate of improvement at all, then the games will become indistinguishable from reality. They'll be indistinguishable. Even if that rate of advancement drops by 1,000 from what it is right now, then you just say, okay, well, let's imagine it's 10,000 years in the future, which is nothing in the evolutionary scale. So given that we're clearly on a trajectory to have games that are indistinguishable from reality, and those games could be played on any set-top box or on a PC or whatever, and there would probably be, billions of such, computers or set-top boxes, it would seem to follow that the odds that we're in base reality is 1 in billions. Right. And actually, arguably we should hope that that's true, because otherwise, if civilization stops advancing, then that may be due to some calamitous event that erases civilization. So maybe we should be hopeful that this is a simulation, because otherwise...
Because they could reboot it.
Well, otherwise, either we're going to create simulations that are indistinguishable from reality, or civilization will cease to exist. Those are the 2 options.
And the reason why it matters to understand that time and space doesn't exist is because in this 3rd density simulation, just like a mechanic can explain a car to you, or a doctor can explain the human body, in this 3rd density simulation is very much a matrix. And that matrix can only be understood by the higher dimensional awareness and beings as we tap into those aspects within ourselves. And so just like someone at Rockstar Games can explain to you the video render for Grand Theft Auto, as we tap into the higher dimensional awareness of things, we understand the ways in which this entire world is a simulation. We have a different body every 7 years. Our hair, the hair we have today, is not going to be the same hair we have tomorrow. And so understanding that every aspect of this world is rooted in the same geometric patterns by the architects of the simulation. We see this with the Fibonacci spiral and other things. It becomes that much more clear that we are living in a simulation. And the reason I would like to explain that is because we need to understand that right now, the way God Source Consciousness explained it to me is that we are in the 3rd density, which is this matrix simulation. In the 3rd octave, which is the solar plexus, it's associated with the gold ray and is associated with anchoring. This is the anchoring density. Even if it's a simulation, we can manifest, we can create. It's associated with the gold ray, like the sun, like the gold currency that we would use to exchange goods and services. And so for that reason, we are in the 3rd density in the 4th vibrational octave, which is the solar plexus, shifting into the 5th dimension, which is the awareness of the heart space and going into positive polarization, which is what ascended masters like Jesus taught us. The heart chakra, which is the fourth chakra, which is the next density that we are moving to, and the next dimensional awareness. And so we're obviously spiritual beings having a human experience. When we go into positive polarization, which people like Jesus taught us, we are now operating from the fifth dimensional awareness and the third density in the fourth vibrational octave, which is the heart space. And in that sense, we become positively polarized, the kingdom of heaven per se, because we become associated with the heart chakra, which from that moment on, we keep moving upwards in positive polarization. So for example, when we pass away from this density, we move, depending on how we left the state as vibrational consciousness and density, we would theoretically move at that point into the fourth density, which is the heart density, in the fifth dimension, which is love and above, in the fifth vibrational octave, because we are now moving into the heart space and we are now beginning the inception of the ascension journey in that state. And so at this point, it's time to again remember that everything is energy and frequency. And so when we think about we are created in God's image, or as above, so below, as within, so without, it's important to remember that just like the Big Bang could be said to be atomic, so is having a baby. You're creating something out of nothing. In that sense, you are in the base chakra, or the first density. And much like in the first density, it's very mineral oriented, as is, for example, semen and blood and those things. And so within each vibrational octave, and the way God explained it to me, or source consciousness, is because there's different mechanics in our multidimensionality awareness. And so in that sense, as we move into the fourth density with the positive polarization of understanding the fifth dimensional awareness in all vibrational octaves. So there are different moving parts. Again, you have to understand this is all density and frequency. And so as we then begin to ascend in that nature, there are certain things that keep going with us as a continuum until we reach the ultimate oneness, or the source consciousness. There is no separation. Whatever power and energy created you, created me and the world around me. And so the divisiveness that has been orchestrated by the architects of this simulation has been for us to not only forget that we are source consciousness, rediscovering ourselves through our human experience, but to keep us in mental, emotional, and spiritual bondage, which is the inception of this video and the first thing we talked about. But understanding that, again, because linear time space does not exist, we are moving in all of those different variant octaves in an endless ripple. There's certain things that have followed us and that remain with us until we return to the ultimate oneness. And so we have been fragmented into different avatars to experience certain aspects of ourselves that we have yet to integrate, transcend, and transmute. But again, because the same power that made you, made me, and everything else, there's certain things that have followed us in all densities and dimensions. And we can think at this point of gender as a charge. Whether you're male or female, there is positive and negative polarity programming in this charge. And the way it was explained to me that it is a charge is because it comes with triggers and activations. There's certain things that, from a vibratory standpoint, from an integration standpoint, from a remembrance standpoint, there's certain aspects of those journeys that are unique to male and female. And we can have many ripples of time and space as one or the other. And again, this is not necessarily always associated with gender or the gender you are born with, but the triggers, enmeshments, and emotions that we have yet to transcend and transmute. And so because there's a spark that we started with throughout this entire ascension process until we return to the ultimate oneness, that's where we see things like twin flames and other phenomenons like that, soulmates and otherwise, because it is an extension of the same spark of the opposite polarity with the opposite charge that has followed us in this entire linear time-space sequence, as people like to kind of associate it with, because people are more comfortable associating our ascension process with time than density. But until we return to the ultimate oneness, that's why whenever we meet our twin flame, our soulmate, the person that you love, and all of these other people that you feel an instant connection with, they come from the same soul family in a very spiritual way, extensions of the same spark, until we return to the ultimate oneness. So think of them more so like the person you are with in the roller coaster that you're all going to do a full circle with and ultimately all return to the source. And so in the same respect, gender, identity, and all of those things, the primary focus should never be on those identifying factors that we come into this third density with, that society or the architects of these systems and these matrix like to keep us associated with, because we are so much more multidimensional than identity and identity politics. And it's something that the more fragmented society remains, the more difficult it is to return to the ultimate oneness and to go through our ascension process, which keeping us in this state of mental, emotional, and spiritual bondage has been an orchestrated design by the beneficiaries of those that benefit from our trauma responses via capitalism. Because a society that is fulfilled, a society that loves, a society that has source consciousness as a primary, is not going to be a society that's going to fuel capitalism, because someone that is fulfilled is never going to go out and buy the newest car, the newest clothes, or otherwise. They already have that source consciousness fulfillment. And so because of this nature, the third density paradigm is associated with ascended masters like Jesus for the sheer nature that love and hate cannot coexist. And so for that reason, because we come into this density with a lot of programming that is attached to outside sources, and because love and fear cannot coexist, we ultimately come to the point of surrender. Because of the nature of choice, we have to either surrender to unconditional love or succumb to fear. And until we completely surrender to unconditional love or succumb to fear, we're going to be in a perpetual state of limbo. And so in this third density, that's where the spectrum of heaven and hell really comes from, because we have all of those vibrational awareness and densities in which you can succumb to extreme fear and paranoia, or to surrender to unconditional love. And upon surrender, that is where you see the resurrection without crucifixion, the death of the ego and its attachments, and why it's said that a rich man cannot enter into heaven, because what that's essentially saying really is that by the time you come to the awareness and that spiritual awakening that we are unconditional love, having human experience, and whatever energy and gravity and power holds your cells together in this incarnation is the same energy and power that holds all. And so when you finally do come to that awareness, the validation of the outside world of the riches no longer will ever mean anything to you. And so for that reason, and because they will never mean the same thing to you they once did, you ultimately surrender those things. You surrender the ego and its attachments, and finally enter the kingdom of the spiritual awakening of heaven, of that higher vibrational being. And so the process of alchemy can kind of be seen throughout every aspect of our world, in the sense that, for example, Jesus had the worst aspects of humanity casted onto him, and in forgiving them, he transmuted the worst aspects of humanity and lifted, quote unquote, those sins by forgiving them and giving them nothing but unconditional love. He transmuted those worst aspects and lifted that. And so that's kind of the process of alchemy that we begin to see. And so the point and purpose of outlining this video is not only to help everyone understand that we have more in common, that we do different, and until we come to that unequivocal understanding and embodiment of so, it's inevitable that discrimination and separation are going to remain in those states. And it is the role of the divisive elite to keep us this way, because the more people can be divided and fragmented, the more powers can lead that individual fragmentation. And so in reality, the way to change the world is to really embody the change and understand that we have more in common than we do different. And until we really understand and embody that, we're always going to be plagued by the illusion of separation, the illusion of other, and thus therefore a bigotry and hatefulness and all of that. Because this world is so much of a mirror, that hatefulness, that bigotry, that illusion you see without is really a projection of the hatefulness and bigotry state of consciousness that may be so much closer than it appears, because the inception of the illusion of separation already lives within yourself. And so I want to close this video by saying that love is the highest vibrational resonance. We are not taught how to love. We do just love. We love our kids, animals in nature, love their family. And so anything that is not rooted in love, and even the darkness we see in the world or the hatefulness, is rooted in the illusion of separation, in the equal and opposite reaction by which they feel love was neglected to them, abandoned from, or walked away in their life. And the earlier that trauma happened in their life, the more exponential the curve is by the degree in which they do those negative and dark things. So angelic resonance and demonic resonance in terms of energy and frequency do exist, right? We call alcohol spirits because they attune to certain aspects and vibrational states of consciousness. And so when we think about these things, angelic beings and demonic beings, it's easier to think about, where does imagination come from? Where does creativity come from? And can it be influenced, right? And so when we think about it from that sense, it's easier to understand the influence these angelic beings and these demonic beings that have gone into negative polarization in the third density of the fourth vibrational octave that will once again return to oneness. But meanwhile, for intents and purposes of this third density paradigm, in the current vibrational octave that we are in, and the dimensional awareness that humanity operates from, they can very much influence the perception of our reality, the perception of our ideology. And until we come into discernment, it's going to be very easy for all of these things, food and drinks and smells and fluoride and all these other things, to influence us and keep us captive and hostage to our emotions that are really imprints of trauma, because we are unconditional love rediscovering itself through our human experience. We are peace. We are that source consciousness. But because we live in a society that is predicated on those unhealed wounds and trauma, we don't necessarily get to really come into that awareness. And so for that reason, in terms of everything being energy and frequency, some things will lower your vibrational state. You can see this with sugar. You can see this with all these other things that work synergistically. Foods, music, smells, and all these sort of things. And our five senses are really a bridge to the higher dimensional awareness and senses. But until we come into that discernment and remembrance, we're going to be easily influenced by this positive and negative polarity and vibrational resonance, until we purge the charge that we talked about earlier. What makes us male, what makes us female, what makes us of a certain vibrational group or category that we have to transcend, transmute, or integrate. And so as we do our inner healing and we focus on not a reactive economy and a reactive culture, healthcare comes after health. Entertainment or distraction or deflection comes after trauma. In that perpetual need for the toxic hustle, which we see so much in the productivity realm of masculinity, is still a deflection or an embodiment of the inner child wound of the fatherhood wound, for example. And the last thing that this paradigm wants to heal is the fatherhood wound, because upon doing so, that masculine that can hold energy and that can hold space for us and love us unconditionally and let us anchor and manifest, the further away we are from that, the easier we are to manipulate and to capitalize from. And so focusing on the underlying issues that are not of a reactive economy, but rather actually productively healing those things, we're going to transcend into a world where we can no longer be mentally, emotionally manipulated and come into mental, emotional, and spiritual sovereignty. So that being said, guys, I hope this video was helpful. I love you guys, and I'll see you guys next time. If you did find this video helpful, please like, comment, subscribe, and donate. The light you see in me is the light you see in you. And it really helps us really reprioritize and honor the work that we actually value in one another. And it really empowers us to value our own creativity when we value the creative works of others. So with that being said, guys, I love you, and I'll see you guys next time.